The millionaire's son couldn't lift a finger until a poor girl did the impossible. He was the millionaire's son who couldn't lift a finger. The entire house lived in silence until a poor girl no one ever noticed broke the rules and made the unbelievable happen. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The Ward's mansion rose on the shores of Lake Tahoe like a fortress of glass and concrete. The lake mirrored the snow-capped mountains, and the cold wind off the water crossed the courtyard like a constant reminder that time didn't really move there. Ethan Ward, owner of one of the country's largest energy companies, came home every night to the same scene, the steady rhythm of medical machines, the constant blinking of lights, and the motionless body of his 8-year-old son, Oliver, lying in a specialized bed. Since birth, the boy had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that compromised almost all movement and speech. Doctors, therapists, and caregivers rotated with factory precision, but nothing seemed to change the picture. Ethan had invested more than he could count in treatments, travel, and equipment, until all that remained was the emptiness of routine. He slept little, ate out of obligation, and spoke to his son the way someone insists on a language no one answers. Each morning began with clinical reports and ended with the same silent question: what was left of the human in them when hope turned into statistics? Rachel Miller arrived on a gray morning, hired to organize the kitchen and oversee the cleaning. Recently widowed, she brought her daughter with her, Grace, an 11-year-old with bright eyes and a restless manner. The contract allowed them to live in a separate annex from the main house, and Rachel accepted without hesitation. Any stability, however small, meant a fresh start. On the first day, while her mother received instructions from the housekeeper, Grace took in the mansion's interior with curious eyes. A thick silence hung between the walls, as if everything had been designed to function, not to be lived in. The air smelled of cleaning product and the absence of voices. She watched the staff walk with measured steps, always in a line, always speaking softly, as if they were inside a hospital. She felt curious about the boy everyone called Little Oliver, whom no one seemed to look in the eye. When she asked her mother if he was sick, Rachel simply answered, "He's special, and his father does what he can." Grace's routine adjusted quickly. Her mother spent the day in the kitchen, and Grace went to school, then stayed home studying, drawing, and watching the movement in the hallways. From afar, she saw Mr. Ward cross the hall with a tense expression and a phone in hand, handling matters that seemed far too urgent to fit inside such a quiet house. In the afternoons, when the wind eased, the nurses rolled Oliver's chair out to the covered terrace that overlooked the heated pool. He would sit there, motionless, staring at the water's reflection without showing any reaction. From the hallway window, Grace would stand and watch for minutes, trying to understand what the boy saw when he fixed his gaze on nothing. One day, curiosity beat fear. She waited for the nurse to step away and approach the chair. Oliver didn't even blink. The air smelled of chlorine and the constant hum of filtration. In a low voice, she said, "Hi, I'm Grace." No answer. She glanced around, picked up a flower that had fallen from a pot, and set it on his lap. "If it were me, I'd want a little color." Then she backed away slowly. Not sure why, Ethan noticed the gesture on the security camera and, on impulse, told the housekeeper to warn the girl not to approach his son. He didn't want trouble or risk. Grace heard the scolding and apologized, but the next day she went back to the same spot. She had the feeling the boy heard everything, even without reacting. She brought a tiny rubber ball, the kind that comes in surprise eggs, and left it on the chair's armrest. "You seem to like looking at the water." "This ball does too," she said. Oliver remained still, but his gaze seemed to follow the object for a few seconds. She held her breath and took a step back, watching. The nurse returned, adjusted the boy, picked up the ball, and took him back to his room. Grace stayed there, alone, looking at the reflection in the glass that separated the interior of the house from the blue pool. She wanted to ask her mother why no one talked to him, but swallowed the question and returned to the annex. The image of that gaze caught on the surface of the water didn't leave her mind. In the days that followed, the mansion kept its predictable rhythm. Rachel cooked in silence. The caregivers maintained immaculate reports, and Ethan kept alternating between meetings and long stretches at his son's side. Sometimes he would sit for hours in the armchair, simply watching the boy breathe, like someone guarding a border. Grace, between schoolwork, watched from a distance. She began to notice that Oliver reacted subtly to changes in the house's light or sounds. When a door slammed, he blinked. When someone raised their voice, his fingers moved. Everything was minimal, almost imperceptible, but real. One afternoon, as she passed the terrace, she saw the pool trembling slightly under the wind, and the boy watching the ripples forming along the edge. She approached again. "It's like it's calling you, isn't it?" she whispered. His eyes stayed on the water. Grace touched the surface with her hand, spreading circles. "I think you like this sound." She didn't realize that Ethan was watching everything from the other side of the glass, motionless, without the courage to interrupt. Later that night, Ethan stayed in his office reviewing the camera footage. He saw the cook's daughter talking to Oliver and felt something he couldn't name. It wasn't irritation nor pity, it was discomfort. He realized that girl spoke to his son without pity, without technique, without fear of getting it wrong. And maybe that was what unsettled him. The doctors insisted on expensive methods, while an 11-year-old simply sat and spoke as if he could hear. That night, Ethan went up to his son's room and stood by the bed, watching. The boy's breathing was calm, his face peaceful. Ethan touched his hand and said softly, "You had company today." Oliver didn't respond, but for a moment seemed to take a deeper breath. Ethan pulled his hand away and stepped back, not understanding why that simple gesture left his heart racing. He went back to the office and stood by the lake until dawn, with the same question stuck in his mind. What if his son was still there, just waiting for someone to touch him without fear? The ward's house had too much space and too few voices. Every hallway seemed to echo the same invisible command. Speak softly, walk straight, don't touch anything. Grace quickly noticed that the adults there obeyed unwritten rules, a kind of reverence that kept everyone at a distance from the boy in the wheelchair. She watched the nurses jot down numbers and leave, without saying a single word to him. It looked like they were caring for a body, not a child. Even Rachel, gentle as she was, avoided meeting the boy's eyes when she brought trays of fruit or tea. Grace felt it was wrong, though she couldn't explain why. Ever since she'd traded a few words with him on the terrace, she couldn't stop thinking about that fixed stare and the quiet that wrapped around everything near him. She started moving through the mansion like someone exploring a guarded territory, learning the staff's rhythm, the timing of shift changes, and the moments when the hallway emptied out. When Oliver's room was silent, she would drift closer without a plan or much courage, driven only by the need to know if he could still hear her. Without realizing it, she turned that impulse into a habit, a daily return no one had authorized. But one she couldn't resist, one muggy afternoon. The covered pool caught the sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling. The smell of chlorine mixed with the nurse's lavender perfume, and the air felt heavy. Oliver sat on the terrace, his chair facing the lake, his eyes turned up to the ceiling. He looked absent, yet alive in a way she didn't understand. Grace stepped in quietly, her sneakers sounding against the stone floor. She sat on the ground a few steps from him and watched for a moment before speaking. "You look bored," she murmured. No response. "If I had to stay still like this, I'd want someone to move me." She took a small plastic toy from her pocket and set it on Oliver's lap. "He hates standing still too." The toy slid off, landed on the chair's arm, and dangled there. She adjusted it again patiently. The boy kept his gaze steady, but for an instant he blinked twice, slowly. Grace didn't notice. She just sighed, looked around, and said, "I think you need company, even if they tell me to stay away." The next day, she returned. This time she brought a small blue ball, a bit faded, and a flower she'd picked in the garden. She slipped through the side gate unseen and came in through the same terrace door. Oliver was there, motionless, sunlight cutting his face into bands of light. Grace set the flower on the chair's arm and the ball on his lap. "I brought you something, but I don't know if you like this kind of thing." She sat on the floor again and started telling made-up stories about frogs, trees, and clouds that changed shape. She didn't expect an answer. She just wanted to fill the emptiness. After a few minutes, something made her stop. His eyes seemed to track her gestures, barely but clearly. Grace lifted her hand and slowly moved her fingers. Oliver's gaze followed the motion. Her heart leapt. "Did you get that?" she whispered. He didn't react again, but she was sure of what she'd seen. When footsteps echoed in the corridor, she jumped up and slipped out before anyone could catch her there. On the other side of the glass, Ethan had seen everything. He was in his office, going through reports, when the cameras showed the cook's daughter on the terrace. He stood still for several minutes, unsure whether to intervene. The scene bothered him, not because the girl was there, but because of what it meant. He didn't like strangers near his son, much less curious children. He felt anger at her boldness, at his own inaction, at the system that had turned that room into a sacred, untouchable place. He called the housekeeper and ordered her to tell the girl to stay away. The message was delivered at dinner, and Rachel, embarrassed, apologized. Grace lowered her head and promised not to do it again. But that night, alone in her room, she sketched the pool and the boy looking at the flower on the floor. Beneath it she wrote, "He heard me, even without speaking." She folded the page and tucked it under her pillow, determined to return, not out of rebellion, but because something in her insisted that his stare wasn't empty. In the following days, the house kept to its usual routine, but the girl stuck to her plan. She waited for the nurse's shift change and for her mother to be busy in the kitchen. Then she hurried to the terrace, always carrying something new, a shiny stone, a toy, a leaf. She talked to Oliver about simple things, expecting nothing in return. "Did you know flowers grow faster if we talk to them?" she said once. "I think people do too." The boy didn't blink, but his eyes seemed livelier, alert to her movements. Time passed slowly, and the girl learned to recognize the pace of that absence full of signs. Sometimes she stayed 10 minutes, sometimes a full hour. When she heard someone coming, she hid the objects and pretended to be staring at the lake. No adult seemed to notice the change in the terrace's atmosphere. Only the father did. He watched on the cameras and, little by little, stopped feeling angry. He kept observing in silence, trying to understand what was happening between the two. On a clear afternoon, Grace brought the blue ball and sat beside the chair. The hum of the pool's filtration filled the space, and the warm scent of water spread through the air. "It's pretty here today," she said. "It feels like the lake and the pool are brothers." She smiled to herself, and without planning to, rolled the ball across the floor toward the water's edge. It slipped in with a soft plop and began to spin on the surface. Grace looked to Oliver, waiting. He fixed his eyes on the ball, following its path precisely. She froze, not blinking. This was real. The boy tracked the object to where the ceiling reflected on the water and kept his gaze there, as if hypnotized by the shine. The girl felt goosebumps break over her arms. She didn't speak or move. She just watched, heart pounding. When the ball finally sank, Oliver blinked once, twice, and his fingers moved. Grace drew a deep breath, holding back the urge to shout. Then she ran to the annex, carrying the picture of that instant in her mind, not knowing their story had just changed. The day broke with an unusual heat for the shores of Lake Tahoe, and the mansion seemed to trap the warm air, as if the glass and concrete were keeping the temperature sealed inside. The staff slowed their pace in the hallways, speaking little and sipping iced water between tasks, while the ventilation system's hum filled the space. Rachel had been in the kitchen since early morning, preparing light broths and sliced fruit, practical for the weather and the nurse's routine. Grace, her backpack open on the annex table, copied homework as the pencil slipped in her sweaty fingers, impatient with the steady filtration noise coming from the covered pool. She finished an exercise, looked up, and noticed a whiter-than-usual light cutting through the side corridor. She pictured Oliver there, facing the water, and had the feeling the afternoon would be less heavy if she just kept him company for a few minutes. She told her mother nothing, made no excuses, drew up no plan. She simply slipped the familiar blue ball into her pocket, took a deep breath, and followed the path she knew. The garden shortcut, the stone curve, the quiet corridor, the door to the terrace where the lake seemed to echo the pool's same glimmer. When she arrived, the chair was set near the edge, and the boy's face was flushed, his gaze more locked than usual on a point above the slats of the ceiling. As if trying to escape the excess light, she stopped 2 steps away, tried not to make a sound with her sneakers, and called his name softly, watching his reddened skin, damp forehead, and the short, quick breaths lifting his chest too fast. The pool water was warm from the heater, but the humidity rising from the surface seemed to ease the room's dry air, and that convinced the girl that staying put was better than going back inside. Grace moved around behind the chair to block the sun from Oliver's face, spread her arms to cast a shadow, and held that simple position for a while, hoping his rhythm would slow. Nothing changed. The filter's drone stayed constant. The water's shimmer added to his discomfort, and the boy's mouth remained slightly open in a silent effort. She tried something else, talking about nothing in particular, describing the swaying leaves outside, the drawing she planned to finish later, the taste of lemonade still on her tongue, the small details that usually caught his gaze when she moved her hands in the air. This time, though, Oliver's focus didn't follow any gesture. His fingertips stiffened, his neck tensed, and his chest raced as if breathing in kept hitting an invisible snag. Grace glanced at the door, thought about calling for someone, but heard no voices nearby, no footsteps, no rolling metal cart. The corridor felt far too empty for an emergency. She spoke louder, called out someone, and the word got trapped in the stone's echo. Sweat slid down her nape. She pulled the ball from her pocket, hoping that splash of color might recapture his attention and somehow steady his breathing. She rolled the ball in her palm, raised her arm, and angled it out of her own shadow so the ceiling's shine would catch on it. Oliver blinked, but kept speeding up, his face growing redder as saliva gathered at the corner of his mouth. Grace crouched, pressed 2 fingers gently to his wrist the way she'd learned in school videos, and couldn't count a clean pulse. The heart seemed to thrum too fast beneath the skin. She called again, now afraid, and started to run toward the kitchen. In the same second, a memory hit like an order. Water always calmed him, and the room's warm vapor made the air feel easier to pull in. She looked at the pool, measured the distance, moved to the edge, dipped her hand, and let a thin sheet of water slide through her fingers, feeling that the temperature didn't sting. "It's warm, it won't hurt," she said, more to herself than to him. The next thought came clear, almost stubborn. If she set the chair right by the edge, maybe the less dry air over the water would help. And if nothing worked, she'd scream again. Carefully, she moved behind the chair and unlocked the footrests with the ease of someone who'd watched the nurses 100 times. She pulled the chair back from the edge, repositioned it, then pushed slowly toward the marble track that bordered the pool. The first contact with the coping made a soft metal-on-stone sound, and she braced her feet, gauging her force. "Easy, Oliver. Just a bit of shade and water close by," she murmured, leaning her body to keep blocking the sun. The boy blinked, and his racing chest eased just enough for Grace to believe she'd made the right call. One last centimeter remained to set the wheels where the chair would hold firm, and with sweaty hands she pushed a little more, focused on the curve of the track. Her weight went with it. The rim slipped on marble dampened by filtration spray, and the whole thing jumped forward in a small, uncontrolled lurch, like the friction had vanished for an instant. The sound of the fall came sharp and loud, a mix of metal, water, and torn air, ripping through the terrace's quiet. The surface exploded in waves that smacked the edge and splashed her face. She stepped back once, then again, until her shoulders met the wall. Time stretched thin. The chair tilted at an odd angle. The safety belt pinned Oliver's torso, and the water swallowed him up to the shoulders. Grace let out a cry she didn't recognize as her own, ran 2 steps toward the stainless steel ladder, slipped on her wet sneaker, and caught herself with a hand on the floor to keep from going down, her throat burning with the urge to call for Rachel, for anyone, for Ethan. Upstairs, doors slammed and heavy footsteps echoed. In the office, Ethan's voice cut off mid-sentence, and the next sound was his suit scraping as he ran. Grace took another step, ready to jump, when one detail froze her at the brink. Oliver wasn't sinking. His torso was supported by the chair's frame, and his arms, rigid moments ago, moved under the water as if testing new territory. One elbow bent, his hand opened, his fingers sliced the water in a kind of search, and his face, once turned upward, tilted a few degrees to the side, as if looking for air he'd never found before. At the edge, Grace clapped a hand over her mouth and cried without sound, her vision blurring with a mix of panic and hope. Ethan burst onto the terrace, blew past her without seeing anything but his son, Dove in fully clothed, and the water erupted again, bigger waves crashing back against his chest. In one motion, he reached the chair, unlatched the belt, lifted the boy, and held him close, like relearning an old gesture. At the first touch, Oliver let out a ragged, short sound, closer to a breath than a word, and that noise slammed through the father like a jolt. Ethan gathered his son into his arms, kept his chin above the waterline, and called his name firmly, twice, 3 times, until he felt the breathing fall into rhythm. Meanwhile, Grace climbed down the metal ladder and reached the edge from inside the pool, gripping the rail to keep from shaking. She kept repeating, "It's okay," barely above a whisper, her teeth chattering, and saw Oliver's eyes fix for an instant on the movement of her mouth, as if that mix of sound and water was putting something in order inside him. Around them, the world snapped back, people running, phones ringing, towels flying, the hurried click of an alarm button no one ever used. Ethan climbed the steps with his son in his arms, water streaming, shoes heavy, tie plastered to his chest, and laid the boy on the towels someone had spread on the floor. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried the weight of shared breathing, the drip of water from clothes, the effort to steady hands that trembled without permission. Ethan touched Oliver's face with his fingertips, brushed the water from his temple, and repeated, "You're okay," in a voice softer than anyone in the house had ever heard from him. The boy kept his eyes open, blinked twice, tugged one corner of his mouth in the slightest motion, and let out another sound, firmer now, short like an answer. Half a step away, Grace didn't know where to put her hands, whether to apologize, explain, or run to get her mother. She stood there, soaked to the knees, watching with a burning chest and flushed face, caught between the fear of having done wrong and the certainty that something alive had just happened in front of her. When the nurses arrived with blankets and a pulse oximeter, Ethan didn't let go of his son for a second. He gathered him up again, knelt by the edge, and pressed his forehead to the boy's, as if he needed to confirm up close that the body there was breathing and responding. The scene fixed itself on the terrace, the drenched father, the son in his arms, the pool quiet after the explosion, and the girl standing still on the other side, the blue ball in her hand. Between shock and relief, a certainty hung in the air, unspoken. The house had heard a new sound, and it came from the boy who, until that day, had never said a thing. The room beside the pool settled into a functional hush while Oliver was wrapped in dry sheets, a warm blanket over his chest, a pulse oximeter on his finger, and the pediatrician cross-checked old records against what was finally appearing before their eyes: steady breathing, clear auscultation, reactive pupils, minimal but present reflexes. When they called Oliver, his gaze shifted as if finding an old track, and the entire room held its breath for a long second. Ethan stood one step away, clothes still heavy, never letting go of his son's hand and never breaking the professional's choreography. Rachel held back tears in the doorway, fingers intertwined, understanding that help sometimes means not adding noise. Grace timed her breathing to the oximeter so she wouldn't disturb this new calm. The housekeeper diverted phone calls, rerouted errands, and hung silence on the walls. The nurses split tasks into short, clear steps. The clock measured without pressing. In the chart, a line that changed the ground beneath them, increased alertness, ocular response to name. No one celebrated, but everyone breathed deeper. The plan they set was simple and firm. Brief stimuli, advance notice, generous pauses. For the first time in a long while, the house seemed to move with the boy, not in spite of him. They began orientation tests with almost choreographed predictability, a voice at two distances, alternating tones, a high-contrast object slowly crossing his field of vision. A light touch announced before it happened. Oliver blinked in cadence, tracked short paths, tolerated contact without stiffness, and every response earned a timestamp, duration, and comfort note in the hardback notebook Ethan opened, like someone raising scaffolding. No adjectives, just repeatable facts. Rachel brought warm tea and soft towels, careful not to add stimuli. The housekeeper trimmed hallway chatter and shut off unnecessary devices. Grace asked to stay and was given a task: show her hand before touching and wait for eye contact before moving on. The pediatrician noticed that regularity widened the focus window and recommended repeating the sequence in short blocks with real rest between them. No one said miracle, they said method. The morning fit inside that clean map, and because the map was simple, it supported the next step. The warm water hypothesis arrived without fanfare: a shallow basin, short sessions, constant monitoring, stop at the first sign of discomfort. They announced each step, brought the basin closer, asked Oliver to touch with his fingertips, and at the contact his hand loosened, his wrist relaxed, his eyes caught on a ceiling reflection. They withdrew, waited, tried again, and the pattern repeated with measurable comfort. Ethan underlined the combination that made sense: warm water, touch announced, voice nearby, generous pause. Rachel set out heated blankets and cotton clothes, and the housekeeper synced cleaning with the rest windows. Grace described the circle she'd make on the surface, waited for his eyes to find her hand, and only then moved the water slowly. They stopped before fatigue, dried him off, moisturized, and logged the results. The goal wasn't to prove a theory. It was to repeat what worked and remove what didn't. The air in the room cleared, not from euphoria, but from precision. And precision finally became hope that fits, with consistent signs. The pool entered the plan as a safe kind of play, shallow area marked, temperature stable, amphibious chair tested, positions defined, Ethan in the water supporting his son's neck and shoulder, a nurse alongside, an observer on the deck. The father announced each step, checked with the pediatrician, and guided brief minutes of floating. Oliver breathed without effort, eyes on the reflections in the glass ceiling, and the team counted focus, time, and comfort without interrupting. From the edge, Grace blew small bubbles through a tube, narrating softly the path of each film and warning before she skimmed the surface with her hand. The boy's fingers opened twice in a timid attempt to touch, enough to earn a double asterisk in the notebook. They stopped at the first hint of fatigue, and the pause felt like care, not retreat. The rule was set: short cycles, long pauses, priority to floating, contact, and voice. Outside, the lake returned a calm light, as if signing alongside them. Grace's presence, once warned against, became part of the method: set times, small, clear tasks, constant supervision. She chose calm songs, showed her hand before touching, announced every position change, and waited for eye contact before proceeding. They noticed early afternoon yielded better focus, and in those sessions the girl described the garden, the shade on the glass, and the glimmer of water on the ceiling, short images with space between them. When he was called by name, Oliver's lower lip twitched slightly, a coincidence Ethan recorded with arrows linking stimulus and micro-gesture, without interpreting beyond what he could see. Rachel sat for a few minutes in a discreet chair, learning the cadence that kept the boy comfortable. The staff traded jargon for simple instructions: announce, touch, wait, observe, pause. Repetition built trust, and trust allowed sensible tweaks to intervals. The day's compass grew clear: voice, touch, water, pause, and a quiet fifth point: record honestly. To close the session, the pediatrician suggested a short, quiet cycle to finish without draining him. Temperature steady, deck clear, the sound of the lake slipping in like a metronome. Grace sat at the edge, brought her hand into his line of sight and, seeing his focus, said "hi" slowly 3 times, shaping her mouth clearly to offer both sound and map. Oliver's lower lip trembled and a short sound slipped out. She repeated at the same pace, and a second sound came, brief but intentional, as if a path had opened between ear and mouth. In the hallway, Ethan noted the time and held his step, letting the line of attention settle before going in. He touched his son's forehead, sketched tomorrow's plan in a few words, and said a single "hi," clean and simple. The boy gave another short reply, a shade firmer than the previous ones. Rachel dried her face, gathered the blankets, and postponed her worries. The team dimmed half the lights and returned the room to rest. In the notebook, underlined, "sound after high, sustained gaze, comfort maintained." When the house finally quieted, the silence didn't feel empty. Grace leaned on the doorframe and kept a joy that didn't need to shout. Ethan touched his forehead to Oliver's, then pulled back, sealing carefully what had been won. Rachel folded the blankets like someone folding memories, and the housekeeper asked that they leave the door just ajar so the room could still hold the water's breath. Outside, a strip of moon drew a line across the lake, and for a moment, the mansion accepted that glow like a signature. The team dispersed without hurry, each person taking a piece of the method so the method wouldn't depend on a single pair of hands. Oliver kept his eyes open a few seconds longer, as if confirming access to a window long closed. And the promise of tomorrow wasn't spoken. It was understood, repeat in the same rhythm, with the same gentleness, until the body turns it into a path. Days later, Rachel stepped into the office to drop off purchase notes and noticed a file box on a low shelf. These were the boxes that had arrived weeks earlier, when Ethan's assistant transferred to the house copies of insurance forms, reimbursements, and reports from Oliver's clinics. Curious, Rachel opened it. Inside were dossiers, forms, and photos. The name Oliver Ward appeared on almost every cover. The papers included informed consent forms, schedules for reflex stimulation, and clinical records. In one envelope, photos showed electrodes on the baby's head. Rachel felt her stomach turn. This wasn't old dust. The documents were far too neatly organized to be accidental. She shut the lid, breathed, opened it again. Then she picked up the intercom and called Ethan. "You should see this." Ethan came down with his son's notebook tucked under his arm. He knew about the treatments and the appointments, but he had never read the full reports. He'd always trusted the doctors and his own administrative staff, who sent him email summaries. Opening the first folder, he found the word shocks described as low intensity and short duration. The photos showed restraints on arms and legs. One report said, crying was interpreted as the expected tonic response. The sentence cut deep. Ethan tried to keep his composure, but the guilt hit all at once. He sat, stood, sat again. He understood he had signed papers without facing every line, and that blind trust had come at a high price. Rachel stayed beside him in silence. When he finished, he couldn't close the folder. He opened it again. He needed to see it all. The decision came easily. Expose it. Ethan called his attorney, organized a digital folder with dates, signatures, and photos, and requested an ethics review and suspension of the protocols named, with accountability by name. He explained he wasn't chasing headlines. He was correcting course. Rachel backed him. Grace didn't understand the terms, but she sensed the gravity in the adult's contained movements. The hospital was notified. The professional board was alerted. The first responses came in the same passive voice as always. Procedures were performed. Parameters were observed. Even so, the story left the shelves. The press began calling, and terms like restraint and electrical stimulation in infants became talking points. The fallout grew. Families wrote, "It happened to us." Prosecutors requested full copies. Specialists split between the context of the time and ethics don't have a timestamp. The board opened an inquiry with deadlines and hearings. The mansion stopped being a fortress and became an address of responsibility. Doors half open, schedules set, focus on Oliver. Care isn't a showcase, Rachel kept telling the staff. Ethan gave short interviews, admitted he hadn't read everything when he should have, and promised transparency. He stopped seeing himself as someone who had failed forever and began to see himself as someone who could fix things. And every time the camera switched off, he went back to the water's edge. In the warm room where headlines didn't reach, the method continued. Oliver, now more alert, followed the bubbles with less delay. Grace blew gently, counted softly, and offered her hand as a resting place for his gaze. The warm water kept helping. Relaxation, focus, an attempt to open his fingers. Ethan wrote without metaphors, tried to touch, repeated, comfort maintained, pause. The pediatrician approved, consistency, short blocks, generous intervals. The house adjusted light, quiet, and blankets into a routine. When they said, "Oliver," his lower lip moved in a rehearsal of sound. Too little for a report. A lot for anyone watching up close. By week's end, the lake was reflecting a calm afternoon. Grace sat on the edge, blew a line of bubbles, and waited. Oliver lifted his fingers and touched the surface for a clear instant. No one applauded. They repeated it. Ethan wrote, "Touch confirmed," underlined it once, and closed the notebook. Rachel straightened the blanket. The pediatrician nodded, satisfied with the simple. Grace leaned in again, and the bubbles came smaller, like steps. Oliver pressed against the film of water and smiled with his eyes. Then she said with a quick laugh, as if sealing a pact, "You don't have to swim. You just have to keep trying." The years passed, like a lake through the seasons. Some mornings mirrored clear skies, others brought winds that ruffled the water, but in all of them, Oliver moved one step beyond the last. First came the simple words, the ones that fit neatly in the palm of a hand. Hi, water, more, dad, Grace. Then, with practice and patience, came short sentences full of air and intent that opened doors where there had only been closed windows. With steady physical therapy and the help of bars and belts, he learned to stand, then to take short steps, and finally to walk the wooden deck, keeping pace with the lake's movement. The world was no longer a distant thing he watched from inside. It was a place he moved through, slowly, yes, but with the confidence of someone who had learned to listen to his own body. Days fell into routines that blended music, reading, warm water, and a collection of small victories, each one logged in the notebook that now slept open on the table. And on hot afternoons, everyone's favorite picture repeated itself, father and son walking side by side to the edge, the soft squeak of rubber soles, the smell of chlorine, the light on the ceiling, and the quiet certainty that all that effort had been worth it. Rachel stayed in the house like someone who knows the map of care with her eyes closed, adjusting blankets, setting schedules, quietly protecting the routine that saved that boy. Life with Grace, who grew from a restless girl into a steady young woman, stepped out of the work protocol and into the realm of family, that badge-free place where affection arranges itself without asking permission. Breakfast brought laughter, school stories, test runs of recipes that worked and ones that didn't, and the kitchen stopped being a service space and became the heart of the home. When anyone needed to remember something important, it was Rachel who appeared with the all-seeing look and the exact phrase that restored balance. And when Oliver wanted to practice new words, it was Grace's voice he reached for, as if her melody were the shortest bridge between thought and mouth. The family, once wounded by silence and reports, now recognized itself in what it said, in what it cooked, and in the promises it kept. The mansion stopped being a backdrop for pain and became a place of good routine, filled with smells, sounds, and memories that begged to continue. The case the press came to call the Ward case turned into a touchstone whenever people discussed ethics in pediatric medicine, not because of raw pain, but because of what was done with it afterward. Protocols were revised. Committees began to include parents and caregivers. New consent forms used plain language and set non-negotiable limits. And the context of the time gave way to the best practice possible now. It wasn't a witch hunt. It was about setting a true north that would stop scientific-sounding violence from repeating. Researchers cited the case at conferences. Universities created modules on compassionate communication, and hospitals opened their doors to active listening for families, with the humility to learn and correct. When Ethan was invited to speak, he always refused any personal spotlight and repeated, "The face of this story is my son's." And while slides laid out what needed to change, it was the image of a boy trying to touch a bubble that made people truly understand why change was urgent. The mansion, which at first sheltered hard memories, became the headquarters of a foundation dedicated to humane therapies, with a heated pool, rooms for gentle sensory work, accessible gardens, and a library of methods that all began by asking, what does the body accept? Ethan ran the institution with the same data-driven obsession he once used to chase answers. But now the spreadsheets came with hands and names. Teams learned to announce, touch, wait, observe, pause, record, repeat, and the verb to care took on the shape of a method that respects each child's time. Rachel coordinated the welcoming of families, teaching that hot coffee and the right silence at the right moment are also therapy. Grace led programs for young people, bringing music, reading, and water like simple, powerful tools, and every new smile earned a place on the mural by the entrance. The house that had been a fortress turned into an open door. People arrived anxious and left with a map. At the Foundation's annual event, when Oliver was already a teenager, came the moment no one rushed. He climbed the stage with steady steps, hand on the railing and eyes meeting the crowd, raised the microphone to the right height, and breathed the way he'd learned in the water, slowly through his nose, counting to 3. The room held a silence exactly the size of the courage it takes to speak. And the courage came simple and whole when he said, "I learned to live when someone believed I could feel." There wasn't a better line to say. Applause rolled in like a wave, but it didn't drown out what mattered. The gentle timbre of a voice that for a long time almost no one expected to hear. Ethan bowed his head and smiled with his eyes. Rachel pressed a tissue to her face and nodded discreetly. And Grace in the front row bit her lip to hold back tears and let only enough spill to keep the moment from passing like any other. The world outside stayed busy, but in that room, time learned to move at the speed of care. After the ceremony, with no speeches and no cameras nearby, they took the usual path to the lake, past the corridor where old photos now looked like a different life. The wind carried a brief chill that no longer frightened them. The water trembled in small waves, as if inviting them without hurry. Oliver reached out and touched the surface with his fingertips, feeling the same coolness that once organized the chaos inside. "I still remember," he said softly. And inside that line were all the others, the ones that hurt, the ones that healed, the ones that taught him to stop before exhaustion. Ethan laid his hand over his and answered, "This is where you were reborn." There was nothing to add. The late afternoon light broke into bands across the water, and when they stepped back a few paces, the house appeared in the background as it had never been before, alive, full of sound, laughter spilling from the windows, and the gentle stir of people who know why they're there. The camera, if it existed, would pull away slowly until the lake, the sun, and the roof fit into the same frame. And the frame would say, without a caption, that the impossible sometimes only needs time, a method, and people who don't give up. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.